A door closes, not slammed, just a soft, final click. The quiet sound of a whole life being locked away on the wrong side of the glass. Rain comes down hard on stone steps. A young man stands there in the cold, a trash bag in one hand, an old fishing box in the other, watching the only home he has ever known go dark behind him. They think it's over. They think a closed door is the end of the story. But somewhere out past the forgotten roads, in the dark of a house no one remembers, something waits, locked in steel, hidden behind a memory. A truth, a dying man buried where only love could find it. And the cold that follows him into the night is nothing compared to the storm he's about to bring back. The cold had a way of finding the small places, the gaps in a door, the thin seam of a window, the space under a young man's collar, where warmth used to live before the world decided he no longer needed any. Eli Carter sat in the front seat of an old car, somewhere off the road, somewhere the streetlights had forgotten. He cupped his hands together and breathed into them. It did almost nothing. The breath came back as a small white cloud and faded. The way most things in his life seemed to be fading lately, quietly, without asking, without so much as a goodbye. On the seat beside him sat a paper cup with a few coins inside. He had counted them 3 times that night, not because the number would change, because counting them gave his hands something to do that wasn't shaking. There were not many coins. There was not much of anything. And yet, in that cold little car, there was one thing that still carried heat. Not the kind a person feels on the skin. The other kind. The kind that lives inside memory and refuses to be put out. It sat on the floor by his feet. An old fishing tackle box. Green once, maybe. In some kinder year. Now it was the color of something that had been loved and rained on for a long time. The latches were rusted, one corner was dented, and along the handle, worn smooth and pale, were the marks of a hand much larger than his own, his father's hand. Eli looked at that box the way a person looks at a telephone that has stopped ringing, with a hope he was ashamed of. He had not opened it. Not once. Not since the night they put him out of the house with a trash bag and a sentence that still echoed in his ears. Because opening it meant something. Opening it meant agreeing that his father was truly gone. And the young man was not ready to agree to that. Not yet. So he sat, and he breathed into his hands, and he let the rain tap its slow, patient rhythm on the roof above him, like fingers drumming on a table while someone decides what to do with you. 3 weeks. That was how long he had lived this way. 3 weeks of waking at strange hours to find frost grown on the inside of the glass. 3 weeks of parking in the far dark corners of lots where no one would tap on the window and ask him to move along. 3 weeks of being a person the world had quietly set down and walked away from. He had not always been this. That was the part that hollowed him out from the inside. He let his eyes close, and the warmth of another life pressed in around him, soft and cruel. A big house on a rise above a wide, still lake, tall windows that caught the morning and held it. The smell of coffee and toast drifting up a curved staircase. A father's voice calling his name from the kitchen below, not because anything was wrong, but only to say good morning to him. His father had built all of it. Not with luck, with years, with a kind of stubborn, patient work that began with very little and grew slowly, the way strong and lasting things tend to grow. Thomas Carter was the sort of man who shook the gardener's hand with the same warmth he gave to men in fine suits. The sort who remembered the names of the people the world trained itself to overlook. The waitress, the man who fixed the boiler, the boy who delivered the papers in the gray hour before dawn. He used to say a thing to his son. Often. So often the boy had grown tired of hearing it. A man's worth isn't in what he keeps, Eli. A pause, and then the rest, every time. It's in how he treats the people who can't do a single thing for him. The boy had rolled his eyes at that, the way young men do when they believe they have all the time in the world to learn things later. He understood it now. He understood it in a way that pressed against his chest until it was hard to breathe, because his father was gone, and the people who could have done something for the boy had chosen to do nothing at all. The rain pressed harder against the glass, and the memory turned, the way memories do when you give them a little quiet, toward the part he tried his best not to visit. She had come into their lives some years before. A woman named Sylvia, polished, careful, the kind of beautiful that felt arranged, like a table set for important guests who somehow never quite arrived. The boy's mother had been gone a long while by then, and his father was a man with a wide, open heart and a wide, half-empty house. Sylvia knew how to fill a room. She knew how to laugh at exactly the right moment. She knew how to make a lonely man feel, for an evening, a little less alone. And Thomas, for all his cleverness with the wide world, was soft in the one place that mattered. He let her in. She brought a son of her own, Trent, a young man a few years older than Eli, with a smile that never quite reached the eyes, and a habit of looking around the big house the way a buyer studies a thing he has already decided to own. For a while, it almost worked. Almost. There were dinners. There were holidays. There was the strained, polite music of people doing their best impression of a family. But the boy noticed things. He had a quiet way about him, and quiet people see more than they are given credit for. He noticed how Sylvia's voice cooled the moment his father left the room, how Trent counted what was not his to count, how kindness in that house began to feel like a performance, with the curtain hanging just out of sight, ready to fall. And then his father got sick. It came on slowly at first. Then it came on fast. His strong, steady father, the man who could fix anything with his hands, and a quiet afternoon, began to seem tired in a way that frightened the boy. His grip weakened. His memory slipped its moorings. Some days the bright, sharp man Eli loved would look at his own son with a strange gray fog behind his eyes, reaching for a thought that kept stepping back into shadow before he could catch it. The doctors spoke in soft, careful words. His heart, they said. His heart was simply tiring. And one flat, silver morning, with the lake lying still as glass outside the tall windows, it stopped. Just like that, the boy's whole world tilted on its edge and slid. In the cold car, Eli pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and breathed slowly until the burning behind his eyes eased back down. He would not cry again tonight. He had made himself that promise, and it was one of the few things he had left to keep. The part that came after the funeral was, in some ways, harder to carry than the loss itself, because grief, at least, is honest. What followed was not. There had been a reading, a long room with heavy chairs and a longer table, and a man named Howard Crane sitting at the head of it, with silver hair and a voice as smooth as the polished wood beneath his folded hands. Howard had been part of the family for years. He had come to the boys' birthdays. He had carved the bird at more than one holiday table. He had called Eli son with a wink and slipped him a folded bill when his father wasn't looking. Howard was, the boy had believed, about as close to an uncle as a person could be without the blood to prove it. And it was Howard who read the will aloud. Eli remembered how the man would not lift his eyes from the page, how he stared at the words as if they were strangers to him, how that smooth voice grew somehow smoother, the way a road grows slick and silent in the last second before a person loses hold of the wheel. The will, Howard read, had been changed, recently, quietly, in the final weeks of his father's failing life. Everything, the house, the company built, with all those patient years, the whole of it, went to Sylvia, and to the boy who carried the man's name and his eyes and his quiet, stubborn heart. To him, almost nothing. A small figure, a single line on a page, a sum so thin it felt less like an inheritance and more like a door being closed in a calm, legal voice. Eli had sat in that room and felt the floor go soft beneath his chair. It made no sense. His father had called him his anchor, his steady one, the boy who would carry things forward when the man himself could not. Why would a father like that leave his son to drift out into the cold? The question had no answer, so it became a wound instead. The car had grown colder while he remembered. He pulled the thin jacket tighter around himself and looked, once again, at the green box resting by his feet. The night they put him out played itself back whether he wished it or not. It had been raining then, too. He had stood on the wide stone steps of the house he was raised in, a trash bag of damp clothes in one hand, the fishing box in the other. Because the box was the one thing he had managed to take from his father's study before the hands of strangers began to steer him toward the door. Sylvia had stood behind the glass, safe, dry, wrapped in something soft and costly. Trent beside her, wearing that smile of his. Her words had come through the narrow opening of the door, cool and even, the way a person reads aloud the weather for the coming week. "You're a grown man now, Eli." A pause, the kind that lets a blade settle into place. "This house belongs to me. There's nothing for you here." And then the door had closed. Not slammed. A slam would have been passion, and passion would have meant she still felt something. This was worse. This was a soft, final click. The small, tidy sound of a lock deciding a boy's whole future without him being allowed in the room. He had walked down that long, curving driveway with the rain flattening his hair against his forehead, and he had not let himself look back, because looking back would have meant believing it, and some quiet part of him, even then, had refused. A car passed by on the distant road, its headlights sweeping across the inside of his cold little world, and then leaving it dark again. Eli watched the glow stretch and thin and disappear, and in the silence that settled afterward, a thought he had been holding off all night finally arrived and sat down beside him. He was hungry. He was tired down to the bone. He had counted his coins one too many times, and the warmest thing he owned was sitting at his feet, unopened, because he had been too afraid to look inside it, afraid of what would not be there, afraid that emptiness would turn out to be the final word his father had left him. But a person can only run from a thing for so long before the running costs more than the truth ever could. So he reached down. He lifted the box up onto his lap. It was heavier than memory had made it. The metal was cold against his palms, colder somehow than the night itself, and the latches resisted his fingers the way old things resist being woken from a long sleep. He worked them open with stiff, careful hands. One, then the other. The lid lifted with a small, complaining creak, and the smell rose up to meet him. Lake water, old metal, a faint trace of the oil his father used to work into the reels on slow Sunday evenings. And underneath all of it, somehow, impossibly, the smell of him. Eli went very still and let it move through him like warm water poured slowly over cold hands. For a moment he was small again, standing on a wooden dock in the gray-gold light just after dawn. His father's big hand wrapped gently around his small one, guiding the line out over the water. The patience in that grip steadier and surer than anything the world had offered him since. "Slow, Eli," the voice said inside the memory. "The fish aren't going anywhere. Neither are we." The young man in the cold car let his eyes close. When he opened them, he made himself look at what was actually there in front of him. Tangled fishing line, a few dried-out lures with the paint worn off, rusted hooks that had not touched the water in a long time, the plastic trays faded and cracked along their edges. It was a box of old things a grieving man had once carried out into the rain. And something inside Eli broke a little further because he had hoped, foolishly, the way the grieving allow themselves to hope, that there might be something more in here. A word, a sign, some small proof that his father had not simply forgotten him there at the end. But there was nothing, just hooks and line and the smell of a life that was over. He let his hands rest flat against the trays, and as he did, weary and hollow and ready at last to close the lid on the whole aching thing, the bottom of the box shifted, just slightly, a small movement under his fingertips, a give that had no business being there. Eli froze. He pressed down again, harder this time, his breath held tight in his chest. And the floor of the box clicked. A soft, deliberate sound. The sound of something built by a careful hand to be found by the right person at exactly the right time. His heart, which had been beating slow and low all night, suddenly remembered how to run. He pulled the trays free and set them on the seat beside him. He ran his fingertips along the inside edges of the box, searching, and found a thin seam where there should have been only solid plastic, a false bottom. He worked a fingernail beneath the lip of it. It resisted. Then, with a faint scrape, it lifted, and the young man's breath stopped entirely. Underneath, resting in the dark hollow his father had hidden there, lay a small folded square of yellow paper, and beside it, a key. Not a house key, not a car key, a small, plain, silver key, the kind that opens something a person has gone to great trouble to keep safe. Eli's hands began to shake, and this time the cold had nothing to do with it. He reached in and lifted the paper as if it might turn to ash between his fingers. He unfolded it slowly, one careful crease at a time. The handwriting reached him before the words did. His father's hand. There was no mistaking it, but not the steady, even script the man usually wrote in. This was rushed, slanted, pressed hard into the page, as if set down quickly, in fear, by a man who had little time left and a great deal he needed to say. Eli held the page up to catch the thin gray light coming through the windshield, and he read, "Eli, if you are reading this." Then it happened the way I was afraid it would. Listen to me, son. Listen close. What they read to you in that room was not my voice. Those were not my wishes. A father does not throw away his anchor. The boy's eyes blurred. He blinked the wet away and kept reading. There are things I could not say out loud. There were ears in that house that were not mine to trust. Do not trust Howard. I know how that sounds. I know what that man has been to you all these years. But the one who smiles at you is not the man I once believed I knew. Eli felt the cold of the car drain away from him, replaced by something hotter and older. His hands gripped the paper tighter. I left you nothing on paper, because anything I put on paper, they would have found, and they would have taken from you. So I left it where they would never think to look. In the one thing of mine they were certain was worthless. A small broken sound escaped the boy, half a laugh, half a sob. It surprised him in the quiet. The box. His father had hidden a future inside the one thing that looked like junk, inside the one thing the boy would carry out the door without a second thought, because it smelled of love and not of money. The letter went on, and the lines grew shorter near the end. As if the man's hand had begun to tremble too hard to hold them long. The key opens a door. The door is not close by. You'll have to go and find it, the way we used to hunt for the good fishing spots together. Off the road, where no one bothers to look. I am sorry, Eli. I am sorry for what you've had to carry, but you are stronger than they know. You were always stronger than you let yourself believe. When you finally get there, look up. I love you, son. Dad. The boy sat with the letter pressed flat against his chest in a cold car on a forgotten road, and for a long while he did not move at all. The rain kept up its slow rhythm above him, and something deep inside Eli Carter, something that had been lying very still for 3 long weeks, began quietly to stir. He read the letter again, then a third time. He needed to be certain it was real. He needed to be sure the cold and the hunger had not finally gotten into his mind and offered him this gift out of pity. But it was real. The paper was real. The slanted, frightened handwriting was real. The small silver key, gone warm now from being held inside his fist, was real. His father had not forgotten him. His father had not thrown him away like something broken. His father had reached out from the far side of everything that had happened and left his son a single thread to pull. Eli wiped his face with the back of his hand, surprised again to find it wet. He looked down at the words once more. 2 of them held him fast. Do not trust Howard. He turned that over slowly in his mind, the way a person turns over a stone they have stepped on 100 times, never once wondering what might be living underneath it. Howard Crane, the man with the silver hair and the smooth, unhurried voice, the man who had read the will aloud and would not lift his eyes from the page, the man who called him son. A chill that owed nothing to the weather climbed slowly up the boy's spine. If his father was right, if the will had been a lie dressed up in careful legal clothing, then the sorrowful man at the head of that long table had not been mourning at all. He had been performing, and the soft click of that closing door, the cool and even voice of the woman who had taken everything. That had not been the ending of a story. It had been the cover of one. Eli looked down at the key lying in his open palm. The door is not close by. You'll have to go and find it. He had almost no money to speak of. He had a tank that sat closer to empty than to full. He had a body that ached from sleeping folded into a seat, and a stomach that had long since given up complaining out loud. By every reasonable measure, the smart thing, the safe thing, was to do nothing, to stay small, to survive the night and then the next one, and to let the dead bury their secrets. But his father had not raised a boy to stay small. And there are moments in a person's life when the grief and the fear and the cold all step back at the same time. And what is left standing in the middle of it is something very simple. A son who has been told, against all the evidence the world piled up against it, that he was loved. A son who has been handed a key and asked gently to follow where it leads. Eli folded the letter with great care, the way a person folds something they intend to keep for the rest of their days. He slid it into the inside pocket of his thin jacket against his chest, where he could feel the slight weight of it with every breath. He closed his fist around the key, and he looked out through the rain-streaked glass at the dark road ahead, the road that led somewhere he had not yet imagined, toward a door he had never seen, in a place his father had hidden away from the whole watching world, off the road, where no one bothers to look. The young man let out a slow breath. It still came back to him as a small white cloud against the cold, but this time he did not feel quite so alone inside it. He set the green box gently on the seat beside him, the way a person settles a passenger they are glad to have along for the road. He turned the key in the ignition. The old engine coughed once, hesitated. Then it caught and held, and rumbled low beneath him like something willing to try. The headlights pushed out into the falling rain, and somewhere out in that dark and patient country, a forgotten house was waiting. A house with a locked door, and a secret that two careful, smiling people had already, quietly, begun to hunt for. They believed they had won. They believed the story was finished. The boy erased. The door closed for good, and the lock turned tight behind him. What they had not counted on was that a father's love could prove more stubborn than all their careful lies put together. And not once in all their planning had they thought to look inside an old green box that smelled of lake water and oil, and a man they had decided long ago was worth nothing at all. Eli Carter put the car into gear, and in the cold and the dark and the steady falling rain, he began at last to drive toward the truth. The house where no one looked, the road did not want to be found. It narrowed the deeper the young man drove, the way a thought narrows when a person follows it too far into the dark. The wide lanes gave way to a county two-lane. The two-lane gave way to something cracked and patched and half forgotten. And the forgotten road gave way at last to gravel and mud and the long arms of trees leaning in from both sides, like a crowd closing around something it did not understand. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had grown thoughtful, slower, heavier, the kind of rain that does not hurry, because it knows it has the whole night ahead of it. The old car groaned against the climb. The headlights pushed out into the wet dark and found nothing but more dark waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Eli kept both hands on the wheel, and he kept the letter in his mind, folded there, warm against his chest. Off the road, where no one bothers to look. His father had a gift for understatement. This was a place the maps had long since stopped bothering with, the same as the world had stopped bothering with the boy himself. There was a strange comfort in that, as if the road in its loneliness somehow understood him. The fuel gauge had been leaning toward empty for a good while now. Eli watched the little needle the way a person watches a clock in a waiting room. Every glance seemed to push it closer to the bottom. He had counted his coins, back in that cold lot, more times than he cared to remember. He knew what they would buy. It was not much, but the body keeps its own arithmetic, and his had run clean out of numbers. His hands had gone slow on the wheel. His eyes burned at the corners. The dark and the rain and the long gray ribbon of road had begun to blur together into one shapeless thing, and the boy knew, in the quiet way a person knows these things, that he could not keep going much longer. Not without rest, not without something warm. And then, a light, small, yellow, low to the ground, off to the right, where the trees thinned and the road bent gently away. A little roadside place, the kind that sits alone at the edge of nowhere, holding its one warm window up against the night, like a hand cupped around a candle so the wind cannot reach it. Eli almost drove past it. Pride is a stubborn thing, even in a starving man, especially in a young one who has been taught these past weeks that the world would rather not be bothered with him. But the warm window caught at him, and his body, which had stopped politely asking and started plainly insisting, turned the wheel before his mind had finished its argument. He pulled the old car onto the gravel and let the engine settle into silence. For a long moment, he only sat there, listening to the rain on the roof, listening to the tick of the cooling engine, listening, too, to the small, frightened voice in his chest that told him to keep moving, to stay unseen, to not let anyone get a good look at how far he had fallen. Then he gathered the few coins from the cup. He pressed them into his palm until the edges bit at his skin, and he stepped out into the wet. The bell above the door gave a tired little ring as he pushed inside. Warmth met him first. Then the smell. Coffee that had been on the burner a touch too long. And something else, simmering low and slow and good, somewhere out of sight in the back. The place was nearly empty. A handful of stools, a long counter worn smooth and pale by years of resting elbows, a radio somewhere, turned down so low it was less a song than the memory of one, and behind the counter, a woman. She was older, the kind of older that a face earns rather than suffers. There were soft lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of a person who had found reasons to laugh, even when the world had not been generous with them. Her gray hair was pinned back without fuss. Her apron had seen a great many mornings come and go. Her name, had he thought to ask, was Ruth. He did not ask. He had not come there to make a friend. He had come because his body had refused to carry him one more mile down that dark and lonely road. Eli slid onto a stool at the far end of the counter, where the light fell thinnest. He kept his head low. He kept his ruined jacket pulled close around him. He had learned, in 3 long weeks, the art of making himself small, of taking up as little of a room as a body possibly can. "Cold one out there tonight," the woman said. She did not look up from the cup she was wiping. She said it the way a person says a thing to soften a quiet room, not the way a person says a thing that needs an answer. Eli nodded, though she could not have seen it. "Just coffee," he said. His voice came out rougher than he had meant it to. He had not used it much these past weeks. There had been no one to use it on. Words go stiff when a person stops spending them, the same as anything else left too long unused. The woman set the cup down on the counter, and then she looked at him. Not the quick, sliding glance most people gave him now, the kind that found him and then hurried away, the way a glance hurries past a stain on a clean tablecloth. She looked at him the way a person looks at another person. She saw the deep hollows under his eyes. She saw the careful way his hand sat curled over the small pile of coins on the counter, guarding them the way you guard a thing when it is the last of its kind. She saw the jacket too thin for the night, and the practiced, quiet smallness of a young man trying his best not to be a burden in anyone's room. She had seen a great deal in her years behind that counter. She knew hunger when it came in out of the rain and sat down in front of her. "Coffee's coming," she said, and then, easy as anything, as if it cost her nothing at all to say it, "You look like a bowl of soup might do you more good than coffee, though." Eli's jaw tightened. "I've only got enough for the coffee," he said. He said it quickly. He said it the way a proud person says a shameful thing, to get it out into the open before it has a chance to sit there and grow heavier in the silence. The woman did not flinch. She did not soften her face into pity, which would have been far worse than the hunger. Pity has a way of making a person feel smaller, and the boy was already small enough. She simply turned and ladled something thick and steaming out of the pot, and set the bowl down in front of him with a thick slice of bread laid beside it. The steam rose up off of it and curled toward the low ceiling. "On the house," she said, before he could find a single word to argue with. "I made far too much tonight. It'll only go to waste otherwise. And I cannot abide waste. Never could." It was not true, and they both knew, somewhere underneath the words, that it was not true. But she said it so plainly, so kindly, with so little weight behind it, that the boy could not find a way to refuse her without making a great deal more of it than she was willing to allow. Eli looked down at the bowl, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight as a fist for 3 long weeks, loosened, just a little. He had nearly forgotten what it felt like, to be seen and not measured, to be handed something and not asked to grovel or shrink or be small about the taking of it. "Thank you," he said. The words came out unsteady. They wobbled in the middle, and he hated that they did. And he meant them more than he had meant anything in weeks. The woman only nodded once, then she went back to her cup, and she let him eat in peace, which was its own kind of kindness, perhaps the truest kind there is. He ate slowly. He made himself eat slowly, though his body wanted to fall on it. The warmth of the soup went down into him and spread out through his cold limbs, and for a few quiet minutes, the dark beyond the window seemed to draw back a step or two, to wait instead of press. He did not tell her his story. She did not ask for it. There is a gift in that, too, and the boy felt the weight of it. A stranger who feeds you and lets your secrets stay your own. But when he finally stood to go and reached again for the small handful of coins, the woman waved her hand at them without so much as looking up. "You keep those," she said. "Where are you headed this hour of the night?" Eli hesitated. He thought of the letter pressed against his chest. He thought of the warning written there in his father's frightened, hurrying hand. "Do not trust Howard." "Just up the road a ways," he said carefully. "A family place." The woman studied him a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they understand a good deal more than has actually been said out loud. "Roads get lonesome out past here," she said, "and the dark out this far has a way of getting into a person. You take care on them." It was a small thing, a handful of plain words from a stranger in an empty room on a night soaked through with rain. But Eli carried them out into the weather with him, tucked away beside the letter against his heart, and they were warm there too. The car coughed back to life, and the boy drove on into the dark, a little less hollow than he had come to it. The trees closed in again behind him. The gravel turned to packed dirt. The dirt turned to two muddy ruts with a stripe of weeds running down the middle, and the wet weeds dragged their fingers along the underside of the car as it crawled forward into the black. The headlights jumped and swung over roots, and over the leaning remains of a fence long given up on. And then, all at once, the trees fell away. A clearing. Eli eased the car to a stop and let the engine die. And the silence of the deep woods rushed in to fill the space the noise had been holding. Thick and heavy and complete. He sat there, and he stared at his father's secret through the rain-streaked glass. It was a letdown. There was no kinder word for it, and the boy was too tired to look for one. He did not know what he had built up in his mind on that long, dark drive. Something hidden and grand. Something worthy of all the fear his father had folded so carefully into that letter. A fortress. A vault behind a wall of stone. What stood in the clearing instead was a house. An old, narrow, two-story house with a steep roof, sitting alone in the long, soaked grass. The paint had surrendered years ago. It hung off the boards in long, curling strips, like the bark of a dying tree. One of the front windows had been boarded over with a warped sheet of wood. The porch roof sagged in the middle, weary, as though it had been holding its breath far too long and had finally let it go. It looked like a house the world had set down and walked away from. The boy almost laughed at it. Of course his father had hidden the truth in a place that looked worthless, a place no thief would trouble himself to break into, a place that, to any passing eye, held nothing at all worth the taking. His father had a way with that. A way of dressing the most precious things in the plainest clothes. A green fishing box. A peeling old house at the end of a forgotten road. A son the whole world had agreed, quietly and altogether, to throw away. Eli stepped out of the car into the rain. His shoes sank into the soft, wet ground. The grass came up cold and clinging past his ankles. He stood a moment, letting the weather have him, gathering what was left of his strength. Then he made his way toward the porch. The steps groaned under his weight. He half expected a foot to plunge straight through the rotted boards and pitch him into the dark beneath. He drew the small silver key from his pocket. His hand was shaking again and again. It was not the cold. The lock was stiff with rust and with years. He worked the key in gently, patiently, the way his father had taught him to work a tangled line, with no temper and no hurry. And then, with a low and reluctant click, it turned. He pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked into the silence like something startled awake, and the smell of the place rolled out to meet him. Dust, damp, old wood, and older air. The smell of a room that had not drawn a single fresh breath in a very long time. Eli took out his phone. The little light was weak, but weak was better than nothing. He held it up before him and stepped inside. The pale beam cut a thin path through the dark. It found a room frozen in some other year, furniture draped in sheets gone gray and yellow. A thick carpet of dust spread across the floorboards, soft and even and undisturbed. Cobwebs hanging in the high corners like torn gray lace. He moved forward slowly. His footsteps echoed in the hollow house. Each one rang out loud as a knock on a closed door. "Look up," he murmured to himself. The sound of his own voice startled him in the stillness. He felt foolish saying it aloud. He felt, also, that thin thread of hope again, and he held to it the way a drowning man holds to a rope. He swept the little light across the room toward a dark hallway at the back of the house, and the beam caught something on the floor that turned his blood to ice in his veins. The dust. It lay thick and even across the whole wide room. Soft, undisturbed, like a field of fallen snow no one had walked through, except for one thing, cutting straight down the middle of it, leading from the front door toward the back of the house, a set of footprints. They were not his. His own prints lay behind him, small and flat, the worn, smooth soles of cheap and ruined shoes. These were larger, deeper, the heavy, grooved tread of a boot built for hard and serious use, and the edges of them, where the boot had pushed the soft dust aside, were still sharp, sharp. Eli's heart began to slam against the inside of his ribs. Old prints would have softened by now. The dust would have crept slowly back in, the way dust does, settling over the marks until they blurred into the rest. These had not blurred. These were fresh. Someone had been here, recently, within a day, perhaps within hours. The boy stood very still in the dark, and the warmth that Ruth's soup had given him drained out of his body all at once, leaving the cold to rush in and take its place. His mind went, of course, to the two careful, smiling faces he had left behind on that wide stone porch, to the cool, even voice, to the soft, final click of a closing door, to the silver-haired man who would not lift his eyes from the page. Do not trust Howard. If his father was right, if the will was a lie, and the smiling man was not the man he had pretended all these years to be, then they had not stopped at the house on the hill. They had not been satisfied with the rooms and the company and the long, patient years his father had poured his whole life into. They had wanted whatever this place held too, and they had gotten here first. The thought settled in the boy's stomach like a cold and heavy stone. Had they already taken it? Whatever his father had hidden. Whatever he had spent his last frightened strength trying to protect. Had it already been carried off into the night in the hands of a stranger in heavy boots? Eli's fingers tightened around the phone until the cheap plastic creaked. Every part of him wanted to turn, to run back to the car, to drive and drive until the trees gave way to lights, and people and the ordinary, comforting noise of the living world. But his feet did not carry him toward the door, because there was a line his father had written that would not let him leave. When you finally get there, look up. If the man in the boots had found what he came for, he would not have lingered. He would not have bothered to search the whole house. The prince would lead in, and the prince would lead back out, and that would be the end of the story. Eli followed the prince with a trembling little light. They went down the hallway. He went after them, slow and soft, every old board beneath his feet a quiet threat. The prince led into a back room, a study once by the look of it. The sheet had been torn off an old desk and flung aside in a heap. The drawers had been yanked out and emptied onto the floor. Papers lay scattered everywhere, pale against the dark wood, like dead leaves blown in through an open window. The room had been searched in a hurry, searched by the look of the mess in a rising frustration, and the boy's racing pulse found somehow a strange and steadier new rhythm, because a man who finds what he is looking for does not leave a room torn apart like this. A man who finds what he wants takes it, and he goes, and he does not waste his anger on the furniture. This was the work of someone who had searched the whole house and failed. They had missed it. Whatever it was, they had not found it. Eli raised the light slowly toward the ceiling of the study. Flat, ordinary, nothing. He stepped back out into the hallway. The boot prints turned there and climbed the narrow stairs. He followed them up, wincing at each long groan of the steps, his breath held tight in his chest. At the top, a small landing, a short hall. The prince paced through the upper rooms, restless, circling, searching, and then turned and went back down again. The man had searched up here as well, and the man had left. Eli stood at the top of the stairs and made himself breathe. In, out, slow. The way his father had taught him, on the dock, when a big one struck, and the line screamed and the boy's hands had wanted to panic. He thought of the words once more. He turned them in his mind, the way he had turned the silver key in the rusted lock. Look up. Perhaps he had been reading them wrong all along, looking up at ceilings, at walls. His father had not meant a direction exactly. His father had meant a place, the highest place in the whole house, the one place above all the rooms that a hurried man in heavy boots had torn apart and given up on and walked away from. Eli moved down the narrow hall, the little light leading him on, until he came to a small bare room at the very end. A single closet stood there, its door hanging open into the dark. He stepped inside and lifted the light to the closet ceiling. It was paneled with cheap, flat tiles, the kind that hide an attic above an old house, and one of them, in the far corner, sat just slightly out of true. A thin black line of darkness showed along its edge. A gap. The boy's heart climbed up into his throat. The man in the boots had not looked up. There was a low wooden shelf built into the closet wall. Eli set the phone down where its light could still reach, and he climbed up onto the shelf, the old wood groaning a warning beneath him. He reached up and pressed both palms flat against the crooked tile and pushed. The tile lifted and slid aside with a dry, dusty scrape. A small rain of grit and rotted wood came down into his face. He turned his head and coughed and waved the dust away from his eyes. Then he reached up into the dark above him. His fingers found cold metal, the bottom rung of a folding ladder tucked neatly up inside the opening. He pulled. The ladder came down in a long string of metal clanks, loud as anything in that silent, sleeping house. The sound made the boy flinch and freeze and listen hard for the crunch of gravel outside, the slam of a car door, any sign at all that the man in the boots had circled back. There was nothing, only the rain on the roof above, and his own ragged breath, and the dark, waiting mouth of the opening over his head. Eli wiped the sweat and the grit from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He set his foot on the bottom rung, and he began to climb up into his father's last secret. The attic was close and stifling. The air up there was thick and still and warm in a way the rest of the cold house was not. It smelled of cedar and old paper and the long, slow passage of time. The boy pulled himself up onto the rough plywood floor and rose slowly to his feet, holding the little light out before him like a lantern in a tomb. The attic ran the entire length of the house. He swept the beam from one end to the other, mostly empty. A few sagging cardboard boxes, gray cobwebs strung across the rafters. And then the light reached the far end, and it caught on something that did not belong. Something large, something metal. Eli moved toward it, his footsteps hollow on the plywood, and as he drew closer, the shape of it rose up out of the dark and stole the breath clean out of his chest. A safe, not a small box, not a strong box. A great steel vault, tall as a grown man, bolted down hard into the heavy bones of the house. It had no business being in such a place. It belonged behind guards and glass, not here in the attic of a peeling house at the end of a road the world had forgotten. His father had gone to enormous trouble to set it here, which could only mean that whatever it held mattered enormously. Eli's hand trembled as he raised the light to the front of it, and his stomach dropped clean through the floor. The face of the safe was ruined. There had been a keypad once, a panel of buttons, a small dark screen. Now it was a wreck of shattered plastic and dangling wire. The steel all around it was scored and scarred, gouged with deep, blackened grooves, as if someone had set upon it with a grinder and a heavy hammer in a fury and beaten it until their arms gave out. The man in the boots. He had found the attic after all. He had found the safe, and finding that he could not open it, he had tried, in his rage, to tear the thing apart. Eli sank to his knees on the plywood before the great steel door, and the hope that had carried him through the rain and the dark, the thin, warm thread he had been holding to from the moment the false bottom first clicked open beneath his fingers, began at last to come apart in his hands. Whatever his father had died protecting was sealed away behind that door, and the lock that opened it lay in shattered pieces on the floor. The man in the boots had failed to get inside, but in failing, he had made certain that no one ever would. The boy knelt there in the dark, the little light shaking in his grip, and felt the whole weight of it press down on him at once. The cold, the hunger, the loss, the long and foolish hope that had let him believe, even for a night, that the story might turn. "I came all this way," he whispered to the empty attic, to his father, to no one at all, and his voice broke on the words. He let the light fall in his hand, and the beam slid down across the scarred and ruined face of the safe. and stopped. There, off to the side of the wrecked keypad, taped flat to the cold steel, small and pale, and somehow untouched by all the violence done around it. A square of yellow paper, the same yellow, the same hurried, slanted hand. Eli's breath caught hard in his throat. He reached out, slow, as if it might dissolve if he moved too quickly. He peeled the little note free of the steel and held it up to catch the trembling light, and his father's voice rose up off the page. One more time. Eli, if the lock is broken, then someone has come here before you, and they have failed. The lock they smashed was never the true one. It was the one I wanted them to find, the one I left out in plain sight for them to break. What's written here means nothing to a stranger. It will mean everything to you. The boy let out a sound that was half a sob and half a startled, breathless laugh. His father, patient, stubborn, clever to the very last. He had built a lock to be broken, a trap dressed up to look like a treasure. He had known they might come, and he had let them spend their rage on the wrong door entirely. He had even left the answer in plain sight, knowing it was a language only his son could read. The note went on. Pull the broken panel away. Behind it, you'll find the lock that matters. An old dial. You know the numbers, son. You have always known them. The morning we caught the first one, off the old dock, just the two of us, and the light coming up over the water. You remember? Turn them in order. Slow. The fish aren't going anywhere. Neither are you. Eli pressed the note flat against his chest, and the tears came then, freely. And for once, he let them. Because he did remember. He remembered the gray-gold morning, the cold boards of the dock beneath his small bare feet, the line going suddenly tight, and his father's big, warm hands closing gently over his own, and the two of them laughing as they pulled the thing up, gleaming and wild, into the light. He remembered the day. He remembered every part of it. Numbers no will could ever carry. Numbers no stranger could ever guess at, no matter how long they searched, no matter how hard they swung the hammer. A lock that would open for one person in all the world. A son who had stood on that dock in that light and been loved. His father had not hidden the truth behind steel and a machine. He had hidden it behind a memory only the two of them had ever shared. Eli set the light down on the plywood, where it would shine steady on the door. He drew the small folding knife from his pocket, worked the thin blade behind the shattered plastic, and pried. The ruined panel popped free with a sharp crack and clattered away across the floor. And there, behind it, set flush against the cold and patient steel, was an old round dial. The boy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He reached out and rested his fingers on the cool metal and let the memory rise up to meet him once more. The morning, the dock, the two of them, and the light on the still water, and the whole world for a moment, holding nothing but the two of them and a fish on a line. He turned the dial to the first number. Slow. The fish aren't going anywhere. He turned it to the second. His hand was steady now, steadier than it had been in 3 long frozen weeks. The third. Neither are you. And then, the fourth. For one long moment, nothing. The attic held its breath. The rain held its slow rhythm on the roof high above. The boy knelt in the dark before his father's last and truest door and did not breathe at all. And then, From somewhere deep inside the great steel vault came a heavy, certain, mechanical thud, the sound of a lock that had been waiting in the dark a long, long time. Finally, at last, letting go. What the safe kept. The sound of the lock letting go was a small thing. A single, heavy click in the dark. But it landed in the boy's chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the rings of it spread out through everything. Eli knelt there a moment longer, his hands still resting on the old dial, as if he did not quite trust what he had heard. Then he reached for the great steel wheel set into the front of the door. He braced his feet against the rough plywood. He took hold with both hands, and he pulled. The hinges groaned. It was the deep, reluctant complaint of metal that had not been moved in a long while, friction giving way an inch at a time. The boy leaned his whole thin weight into it, and the heavy door swung open. The little light shook in his hand as he raised it, and the inside of the safe came slowly out of the dark. For a moment, Eli could only stare. He had braced himself for emptiness. He had braced himself even for the cruel joke of a vault holding nothing but dust and a father's good intentions. What he found instead made him sit back on his heels. There was money. Not stacks of it spilling out the way a young man might dream, but enough, bundled and bound and set neatly on the bottom shelf, the way a careful man arranges a thing he means to last. Beside it, small heavy pouches, the kind that hold something worth far more than paper. It was a fortune to a boy who had been counting coins in a paper cup an hour before. But Eli's eyes did not stay on the money, because his father had been a man of plans within plans, and he had known, the way he knew most things, that money alone would not give his son his life back. Money alone would only make the boy a target. On the shelf above the bundles sat the things that mattered more. A thick journal bound in worn dark leather, the corners soft from being handled. A sealed envelope, heavy, with a single word written across the front in that same hurried hand. And a folded set of papers, official-looking, weighted down beneath a smooth river stone, as if his father had wanted to be sure the truth would not blow away. Eli reached for the papers first. His fingers trembled as he slid them out from under the stone and unfolded them in the wavering light. He did not understand every word. He was 19 and tired, and the language was the careful, knotted language of documents. But he understood enough. He understood the shape of it. This was a will, a true one, witnessed, signed, set down in his father's full and steady name, and dated. The boy's eyes found the date and held there. Dated only days before his father's heart had stopped on that flat and silver morning. He read it slowly, line by line, and the world he thought he knew began, quietly, to come apart and rearrange itself into something new. Everything. The house on the hill. The company built of patient years. All of it. His father had left every last bit of it. To him. To Eli. The will named him plainly. It set the woman called Sylvia aside, and her son with her, with cold and final clarity, citing in careful words a breaking of trust so deep it could not be mended. The boy held the page in both hands and read his own name 3 times over, as if it might change if he looked away. It did not change. His father had not thrown him out into the cold. His father had loved him to the very last, exactly as the letter in the fishing box had sworn. The will read for the room had been a lie. A clever, polished, well-witnessed lie, read aloud by a silver-haired man who would not lift his eyes from the page. Eli let out a long, shaking breath, and for a moment, kneeling there in the close dark of that hidden attic, with the proof of his father's love finally in his hands, the boy nearly wept with the simple relief of it. He had been wanted. He had been chosen. He had not been the mistake he had begun, in the cold and the hunger, to believe he was. But his father had left more than a will, and Eli's eyes drifted to the worn leather journal on the shelf above. He set the will down gently. He reached for the book. He drew it into the light and rested it on his knees, and opened the soft cover with the care of a person opening a door he was not certain he should. The pages were filled with his father's hand, but not the hurried, frightened scrawl of the notes. This was the man's everyday writing, steady at the start, growing less steady as the pages turned, as if Eli were watching, line by line, the slow leaving of a strength he had always believed unshakable. He began to read, and the warmth that had filled him a moment before began, page by quiet page, to turn to something colder. His father had been afraid. For a long while before the end, his father had been afraid. The early entries spoke of small things, a tiredness that would not lift, a fog that crept into his thoughts and would not be reasoned away. Mornings when the strong, sharp man could not hold a number in his head, or finish a sentence he had started, or remember the name of a thing he had owned for years. He had thought at first that it was age, that it was grief still, for the boy's mother, that it was the simple wearing down of a man who had carried a great deal for a great many years. But his father had been clever. Even foggy and frightened, he had been clever. And somewhere in those pages, the boy read a line that stopped his breath, a line where his father wrote that on the rare mornings he forgot to take what he was supposed to take. The fog lifted. His mind cleared. His hands steadied. The strength came back, just a little, just enough. And then, when he resumed, it went again. Eli read that line 3 times, and a slow, sick understanding began to climb up through him. The medicine, the thing meant to keep his father's heart steady and his days going, the thing handed to him faithfully, kindly, with a soft word and a glass of water, by people he trusted in his own home. It had been wrong. Somewhere along the way, it had been changed. What was meant to keep him well had been quietly traded for something that wore him down instead. Something that pushed a tired heart a little closer to the edge with each and every dose, day after day, smile after smile, glass of water after glass of water. His father had not simply fallen ill. His strength had been taken from him, slowly, patiently, by a hand that passed him his medicine at the table, and then sat down to eat dinner across from him as if nothing in the world were wrong. The boy sat very still in the dark. The journal trembled in his hands. He thought of all those gray mornings. He thought of his father reaching for a thought and finding only fog. He thought of the man growing weaker and more frightened in his own grand house, surrounded by people who smiled at him and counted the days. And something inside Eli, something young and soft that had survived even the cold of the car and the click of the closing door, went hard. He turned the pages faster now. He needed to know who. His father had needed to know too. The entries showed it. A man, even failing, even afraid, gathering the truth the way he had gathered everything in his life, carefully, patiently, setting one small certainty beside another until the picture could not be denied. And then the boy reached the entry where his father wrote the name, and the breath went out of him entirely. He had expected the woman. He had expected Sylvia, the cool voice, the arranged beauty, the door closing soft and final on his future. Of course it was her, he had thought. Of course. But that was not the name on the page. His father had written, in a hand grown thin and shaking, that the hand behind it all was not the woman's. It was Howard's, the silver-haired man, the man his father had trusted like a brother for the better part of a lifetime, the man who had carved the bird at the holiday table, the man who had slipped a folded bill into a small boy's pocket with a wink and called him son. Howard. Eli stared at the name until the letters blurred. The journal told the rest in its quiet, terrible way. The two of them had not built their lives apart. Howard had been there from near the beginning. The trusted hand, the keeper of the papers, the voice in the room when decisions were made. And somewhere along those years, the trusted hand had grown hungry. He had seen the size of what his old friend had built. He had held the papers that proved it. And he had decided, somewhere in the quiet of his own heart, that he wanted it for himself. But a man like Howard does not lift the weight alone. So he had found someone to stand between himself and the thing he wanted. The woman, Sylvia. His father had understood her better at the end than the boy had ever guessed. The journal did not paint her as a monster. It painted her, in a few careful lines, as something sadder and more human than that. A woman who had come into their lives carrying debts and fears the boy had known nothing of. A woman with her own past pressing on her, her own son to think of, her own quiet desperation. A woman Howard had found and studied and slowly bent to his purpose. He had held her debts over her like a blade. He had whispered to her of the life she could have. He had told her, surely, that she was only taking what a foolish, sentimental old man would waste anyway. And she had let herself believe it. She had let herself become his instrument. She had passed the glass of water. She had spoken the cool, even words on the porch. She had closed the door. But the mind behind it all, the patient and smiling architect of the whole long ruin, was the man who called the boy son. Eli closed the journal. He sat in the dark a long moment, the great open safe beside him, the will and the journal and the sealed envelope gathered in his lap, and he let it all settle into him. His father, dying by inches, in his own home. The lie read aloud in that long, quiet room. The boy thrown out into the rain with a trash bag and a sentence, while the true will sat hidden in an attic at the end of a forgotten road, waiting for a son who alone could open it. His father had known. His father had known, and had been too weak and too watched to fight them in the open. So he had done the one thing left to a clever, dying man with everything to lose. He had laid a trail only love could follow. He had hidden the truth behind a memory of a morning on a dock. And he had trusted that his son, no matter how far they pushed him down, no matter how cold the world made him, would find his way here and would open the door and would carry the truth back out into the light. Eli looked down at the sealed envelope, the single word written across it. His father had spent his last strength building this. The least the boy could do was finish it. He slid a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside were more papers, the proof set down plainly, the records of money moved in the dark, the threads that tied the smiling man to the changed medicine, to the false will, to the woman bent to his purpose. His father had gathered it all and bound it together, the way a man builds the last best thing he will ever build. It was, Eli understood, a weapon. His father had left him a fortune to live on, and he had left him a far more dangerous gift to fight with. The truth. The boy gathered it all close to his chest in the dark of the attic, and for the first time in 3 long weeks, the cold that had lived in him felt like it might one day lift. He had a name now. He had a will. He had the proof of everything. He would walk out of these woods, and he would find the right people, and he would set the whole rotten thing on fire with the light his father had handed him. That was the plan that formed, clean and bright, in the boy's mind. And it was at exactly that moment that he heard the gravel, a crunch, faint, far off, but unmistakable in the deep silence of the woods, the slow grind of tires turning into the clearing. Eli's whole body went rigid. He clicked the little light off at once. The dark dropped over the attic like a thrown blanket, total and sudden, and the boy froze in the middle of it, his heart slamming, his breath caught somewhere high in his throat. He had been so lost in the journal, so swallowed by the truth. He had not been listening to the night. He crept, low and silent, across the plywood toward the small round window set into the gable end of the attic. The glass was grimy with years. He wiped at it with his sleeve and put his eye to the cleared patch and looked down into the rain-soaked clearing below. A vehicle had pulled in, dark, heavy. It had drawn up close behind his own old car, blocking it in against the trees, the way a hand closes over an open door. Its lights cut twin white blades through the falling rain. A door opened, and a man stepped out into the wet. Large, broad through the shoulders, a long dark coat, and on his feet, even from up here, even through the grime and the dark, the boy could make out the heavy, grooved boots. The man in the boots, the one who had been here before, the one who had torn apart the study and beaten the false lock to pieces and walked away, frustrated. He had come back. And he had not come back alone. The far door of the vehicle opened. A second man climbed out, slower, unhurried. He raised something over his head against the rain, and the headlights caught the silver of his hair. Eli's stomach turned to ice. Howard. The silver-haired man stood in the rain at the edge of the light, calm as a person arriving at a dinner party, and the boy heard his voice carry up thin and clear through the wet dark. The boy's car is here. The big man, his voice low and flat. He found the place. A pause, and then Howard's answer, drifting up through the rain, stripped now of every warm and uncle-ish thing the boy had ever heard in it. Then, he's inside. The voice was cold. It was patient. It was the voice of a man who had been smiling for years and had finally set the smile down. Find him, Garrett. If he's seen what's in that safe. A small, terrible pause. Then he doesn't leave these woods. The boy did not breathe. The fear that swept through him was a living thing. It started in his chest and ran down into his hands and made them shake against the cold glass. He was 19. He was tired and hungry and alone at the top of a rotting house in the middle of nowhere. And 2 men had come through the rain to make certain he was never found. Below, the big man moved toward the porch, and a moment later, the boy heard it. The front door kicked hard, the shriek of old hinges, the heavy, deliberate thud of boots crossing the dust-carpeted floor of the room below. Thud, 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 searching. Eli pressed himself flat against the attic floor and tried to think past the roar of his own pulse. He could not go down the ladder. The ladder led to the closet, and the closet led to the hall, and the hall led straight down into the house where the man was hunting. To climb down was to walk into his hands. But the boy had something the man did not. He had read the journal. He had felt his father's patience seep into him from the pages, and his father's voice was in him now. Slow, Eli. The fish aren't going anywhere. Think. He could not panic. If he panicked, he died in these woods, and the truth died with him. And his father's last and greatest work would have been for nothing. So the boy made himself still. He gathered the will, the journal, the envelope of proof, fast and silent, and he looked about him in the dark for something to carry them in. His fingers found the strap of an old canvas bag among the sagging boxes left there years ago. He pulled it to him. He pushed the papers inside, the journal, the envelope, and after a breath, a single bound bundle of the money from the lower shelf, because his father had left it, and a fleeing man needs more than the truth to survive. He looped the strap across his chest, snug, so it would not swing and snag. Then he crept back to the window and looked down once more. The silver-haired man stood near the vehicle in the light, sheltered beneath his raised cover, watching the house with the calm of a man waiting for a thing he believes is already finished. There was no way out the front. But Eli had grown up in a house his father built, and a part of him understood, the way the children of careful men understand, that a careful man does not build one way in and out of a thing he means to keep secret. His father had hidden a safe in this attic. His father had laid a trail through a fishing box across half the dark country. A man like that did not leave only one door. The boy thought back, to the climb up, to the closet, and the ladder, and the way the attic ran the whole length of the house, and he remembered dim at the far end, past the boxes, where the roof came down low to meet the floor, a small square hatch. He had taken it on the way in for a vent, a nothing, a panel in the low wall where the attic met the eaves, but now he was not so sure. Below, the boots had stopped their pacing. "He's been here," the big man called up through the house, his flat voice rising through the floorboards. "Dust is disturbed on the stairs." He went up. A pause, and then the long, screeching rattle of the folding ladder being yanked down out of the closet ceiling. The boy's time had run out. Eli moved. Low and fast and silent, he crossed the plywood toward the far end of the attic, toward the place where the roof sloped down to meet the floor, where the small square hatch sat in the shadow of the eaves. Behind him, he heard the heavy creak of weight on the ladder. A grunt, the scrape of a large body hauling itself up through the opening into the attic. A flashlight beam swung wide across the dark. "There you are," the big man said. Eli reached the hatch. He shoved his fingers into the seam of it and pulled. It resisted, swollen with damp and years, and for one heart-stopping moment the boy thought it would not give at all, that his father had only built a vent after all, that this was where the story ended. And then it tore free with a crack of old wood. Cold, wet air rushed in through the opening. Beyond it was a low, dark space, and beyond that, the boy could see the faint gray of the night and the black shapes of branches close against the house. The eaves came down here near the slope of an old lean-to roof at the back of the house. The woodshed, low and rotten, half swallowed by the trees. A way down, a way his father had built, perhaps, for exactly this. "Stop!" the big man said behind him, and his flat voice had gone sharp now. The flashlight beam found the boy and pinned him against the far wall. "Don't make this hard, kid." Eli did not answer. He threw himself head first through the hatch. He came out onto the slick, sloping roof of the lean-to, and at once his feet found nothing to hold. The old shingles were soft with rot and slimed with rain, and the boy slid, scrabbling, his hands tearing at the wet wood, the bag thudding against his chest. He caught for half a breath on the broken edge of the roof, and then it gave way beneath him, and he fell. It was not far, but it was far enough. The boy came down hard into a tangle of wet brush and old stacked wood at the back of the house. The breath was knocked clean out of him. Pain flared bright in his side and his leg, white and sharp, and for a moment he could only lie there in the cold mud and the dark, gasping, his ears ringing. Above him, through the hatch, the big man's flashlight beam swung out across the trees. "He went out the back," the man bellowed into the house. "He's in the trees. Garrett's coming round." And the boy heard, from the front of the house, the silver-haired man's voice rise for the first time out of its cold calm into something closer to fury. "Then find him! Find him now!" Eli got up. He did not know how. His legs screamed at him. His ribs burned with every breath. But somewhere down beneath the pain, the fear had turned, the way fear sometimes does in a cornered thing, into something hotter and harder and more useful. They had taken his father. They had thrown him into the cold. And they meant to bury the truth out here in the dark woods along with him. He was not going to let them. He clutched the bag tight against his chest. The will, the journal, the proof, his father's whole last work pressed against his hammering heart. And he ran, not toward his car. The car was blocked, surrounded, a trap. He turned away from the clearing entirely and plunged straight into the black wall of the trees. The woods swallowed him. Branches whipped at his face and arms, tearing at his thin jacket, raking lines across his skin. The ground beneath him was a treachery of roots and stones and slick, wet leaves. He could not see more than a few feet ahead. He ran half by feel, half by the faint, gray glow of a hidden sky, his breath sawing, his hurt leg threatening to fold under him with every stride. Behind him, he heard the crash of a large body entering the trees. A shout, a second voice answering, lights swinging wild through the dark, throwing the trunks into sudden leaping shadow. The boy ran on. He fell once, hard, his hands plunging into cold mud, and he hauled himself up and kept going. He did not look back. Looking back was for people who had given up. His father had not raised a boy to give up. He ran until his lungs were fire, and his legs were water. He ran until the shouts behind him grew thin, and then thinner, swallowed by the rain and the trees and the great dark indifference of the woods. He ran until he could no longer hear them at all, only his own breath, only his own heart, only the endless patter of rain on 1,000,000 leaves. And still he kept moving. The night wore on around him. The rain began, at long last, to ease. And somewhere in the deepest, darkest hours, the boy stumbled out of the trees and found, beneath his torn and bleeding feet, the hard, flat surface of a road, an empty road, a pale ribbon winding away into the gray. He stood there, swaying, soaked to the bone, his side aching and his leg half dead beneath him. He was lost. He did not know this road, or where it led, or how far it lay from any living soul. But he was out. He was out of the woods and out of their reach, and the bag was still strapped tight against his chest. He had it, the truth, his father's truth, the thing they had killed for, and lied for, and come through the rain to bury. He had carried it out of the dark. The boy sank down at the edge of the empty road as the black sky began, far off at its edges, to soften toward gray. And there, shaking and hurting, and more alone than he had been in his whole young life, Eli Carter began, very quietly, to laugh, because they had thought they had won. They had read their lie in a quiet room and closed a door on a boy in the rain, and they had forgotten the one thing that even the cleverest of them could not plan for: a father's love hidden in a fishing box, and a son stubborn enough to follow it all the way out of the dark. The first pale light of morning touched the empty road, and somewhere down that road, the boy knew, were people who would listen. He just had to reach them. What the light came back for the first car came with the morning. The boy heard it long before he saw it. A low hum on the still, wet air, growing, rounding the far bend in the pale road. 2 weak headlights cutting against a sky that had begun, at its far edges, to soften from black toward gray. Eli pushed himself up from the edge of the road. He must have been a sight to come upon out there, soaked clean through, torn at both sleeves, mud to the knees, and a long red scratch down one cheek. One leg held stiff and careful beneath him. A young man who looked as though the dark woods themselves had chewed him up and spat him out onto the empty asphalt. He lifted one hand into the gray. The car slowed. It was an old truck, the kind a working man drives for 30 years and trusts more than he trusts most people. Behind the wheel sat a broad, weathered fellow with kind, tired eyes. A man on his way to somewhere ordinary in their early hour, the way ordinary people are. He took one long look at the boy through the rain-streaked glass. The scratches, the mud, the thing strapped so tightly to that thin, heaving chest, held the way a person holds the last thing they have left in all the world. And then the man did a thing that not every man would have done. He pulled over. He leaned across the seat and pushed the door open from the inside, and he did not ask a single one of the careful questions a careful man might have asked. "Get in, son," was all he said. "Looks like you've had a night of it." Eli climbed up into the warm cab. The heater was running. The seat was soft, and the door swung shut behind him with a solid, ordinary sound, shutting out the cold and the dark and the long, terrible run through the trees. For the second time in that endless night, a stranger had looked at a ruined boy and chosen kindness over suspicion. The boy did not tell the man much. He could not. Some of it could not be said aloud yet. Not to a stranger on a gray road. Not until it had been said first to the right people, in the right way, where it would do what his father had built it to do. But he said enough. He said there were people who had heard his father. He said he carried proof of it, here, against his chest. He said he needed to reach the kind of people who could not, in turn, be reached by the men who had done it. The driver listened. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the unwinding road. He understood, perhaps, a good deal more than the boy gave him credit for. "There's bad apples in every barrel," the man said at last, in the easy way a person speaks, to fill the quiet of an early drive. "But there's good ones, too. The trick is knowing which is which, and not letting the bad ones make you forget the good ones are even there." It was a simple thing, the kind of thing a tired man says without thinking much about it. But the boy took it, and held it, and tucked it away beside everything else he had gathered in the dark, because Eli had learned something, that long and bitter night. He had learned that his father had been right about the thing he had said so many times that his son had grown weary of hearing it. A man's worth was not in what he kept. It was in this, in a stranger pulling over in the gray hour, in a woman ladling out soup she pretended was going to waste so a starving boy would not have to call it charity, in the small, unbought kindnesses of people who had nothing at all to gain. Howard had kept everything. And Howard, the boy understood now, was the smallest man he had ever known. The boy knew where to take what he carried. His father's journal had been plain about it. There were people whose hands the silver-haired man could reach into, people he had bought, or frightened, or quietly folded into his long and patient plan over the years. To carry the truth to any of them would be to hand it straight back to the man who had buried it in the first place. So Eli did not go to the near and easy people. He went to the right ones. It took the better part of that gray day. A ride and then another after it. A long wait on a hard bench. A great deal of explaining at the start to people who looked at a battered young man with mud on his shoes and saw, understandably, only trouble walking through the door. But the boy did not have to talk his way past their doubt for long, because he had not come carrying a story. He had come carrying his father's whole last work. He set it down before them, one piece at a time, the way a man lays out the parts of a thing he has built with great care. The true will, witnessed and signed in his father's full and steady name. The journal, with its slow and terrible record of a strong man, worn down by a smiling hand. The bound proof his father had gathered and tied together with the patience of someone building the final, best thing of his life. The truth has a weight to it that a lie can rarely match. And when the boy laid that weight down on the table in front of them, the people across from him stopped seeing trouble. They saw instead the thing his father had spent his dying strength to make, a fire, and they took it up in their hands. The boy did not watch it all come undone. He waited in a small, quiet room while strangers turned his father's truth over in careful hands. And one by one, the locks the silver-haired man had built around himself began to give, not with thunder, with questions and quiet, and the slow, certain weight of a thing that can no longer be hidden. It did not happen all at once. These things rarely do. But it happened. The way a slow tide comes in and cannot be argued with, and takes back the shore an inch at a time. And the boy felt none of the triumph he had once imagined back in the cold car, when fury had been the only warmth he had. He felt only the strange, hollow quiet of a storm finally passing over. But Eli was there for one moment of it. He had not meant to be. He had been asked to stay back, to stay safe and far away, while the right people did the work the truth had set in motion. But the boy had needed to see it. He had needed, after the cold car, and the closed door, and the long run through the black woods, to watch the masks come off with his own two eyes. So he stood at a distance on a gray and ordinary morning, and he watched. He watched as the tall doors of the great house on the hill swung open, the house he had been raised in, the house thrown back in his face as a thing that had never truly been his. The house where a strong man had been handed his medicine with a soft word, and a son had been turned out into the rain with a trash bag, and the people who had taken it all from him were brought out into the gray light. The woman came first, Sylvia. She was not draped in anything soft and costly now. She came out into the morning looking smaller than the boy remembered her, as though some air had gone out of her in the night and left her thinner than before. Her arranged beauty had come undone at the seams, and her face, when she lifted it to the gray sky, was the face of a person waking from a long dream into a colder room than the one she had fallen asleep in. For one moment across the distance, her eyes found the boy, and Eli braced himself. He braced himself for the cold he had seen on that porch, for the cruelty, for the smooth, smug certainty of a woman who believed she had won and meant to enjoy it. But it was not there. What he saw in her face instead was, in its own way, worse, and it was far more human. He saw a person looking out at the wreck of her own life, a person understanding, far too late, what she had let herself become, and for what, and how little, how very little, it had all been worth in the end. His father's journal had been right about her. She had not been a monster. She had been a frightened, hungry person who had let a clever man convince her that she was only taking what a sentimental old fool would waste anyway. She had passed the glass of water. She had spoken the cool, even words on the porch. She had closed the door on a boy in the rain. And she was walking out of that house now, in the gray light, with no house and no name, and nothing soft left to wrap herself in. She had traded the whole of her soul for something she could not keep. She did not say a word to the boy. There was nothing left to say between them, but she held his eyes for a long, still moment before she let them fall away. And in that look, the boy thought he saw something that might, in some other life, have been an apology, or a warning, or simply the dull, hollow recognition of one person who had lost everything, gazing at another who, not so long ago, had lost everything too. Her son came out behind her. Trent, the smile was gone from his face for good. He did not look at the boy at all. He kept his eyes down on the wet stone steps, the way a person keeps their eyes down when there is nothing left inside them worth showing the world. And then, last of all, the silver-haired man, Howard. The boy had braced himself for this most of all. He had imagined the man would rage when his hour came, would protest, would put on the old smooth voice and explain the whole thing away, the way he had once explained away a false will in a long and quiet room. But Howard did not rage. He came out into the gray morning calm and upright, his silver hair neat even now, and for one cold second, the boy saw the man he had known his whole life, the uncle, the carver of the holiday bird, the man who had slipped folded bills into a small boy's pocket with a wink. And then the man's eyes found Eli's across the wet distance between them, and the mask, the last and deepest mask, the one the man had worn so long that it had grown into the very skin of his face, slipped, just for a moment. And underneath it, the boy saw the truth his father had died slowly learning. There was nothing warm there. There had not been, perhaps, for a very long time. There was only a cold and patient hunger, looking out from behind a familiar face at the one thing in all its long scheming it had failed to swallow. The boy who had gotten away, the boy who had walked out of the dark woods with the fire still clutched to his chest. Howard said nothing. He looked at Eli, and Eli looked back, and the boy did not flinch, and did not look away, and did not let the old false warmth pull at his young heart the way some part of it still wanted to. He simply held the man's gaze until the man was the one who looked away, and then the silver-haired man was gone, taken off down the long curving drive he had schemed so patiently to own. And the great house on the hill stood open and empty behind him in the gray and ordinary light. It was over. The boy stood there a long while after, in the place where so much had been taken from him, and he felt, to his own quiet surprise, no triumph at all. He felt only tired, and still, and far down underneath the weariness, the first faint warmth of a thing he had nearly forgotten the shape of: peace. In the weeks that came after, the world tried its best to hand the boy back his old life. The house on the hill was his now. The company his father had built of patient years was his. The papers were signed, the truth was settled, and the name Eli Carter was, once again, fastened to all the things it had been torn from. He could have moved back into those grand rooms. He could have walked the curved staircase he had run down as a child. He could have slept in the wide, quiet bedrooms and lived out his days in soft comfort, in the place where he had once been a boy who knew nothing of cold cars or closing doors. But the boy found that he could not. He stood in the great house just once after it was returned to him. He walked its long halls in the silence, and everywhere he turned his eyes, he saw ghosts. He saw the long room where a lie had been read aloud over a table. He saw the bright kitchen where his father had been handed his medicine with a soft word and a gentle smile. He saw the wide front steps, slick with remembered rain, where a door had clicked softly shut on a boy with a trash bag. The house was full to the rafters with the past, and the boy understood, standing alone in all that quiet, that a person cannot heal inside the walls where they were wounded. So he let it go. He let the great house on the hill go, and he felt himself grow lighter the very moment he did. It held too much, too many lies, too many ghosts wearing the smiling faces of people who had worn his father down while they sat across from him at dinner. And instead, the boy went back to the one place in all the world that had given him the truth. He went back to the house at the end of the forgotten road. The peeling old house in the clearing did not look like much. It had not looked like much that first night, in the rain, when the boy had taken it for a letdown and a worthless thing, and nearly turned around in his bitterness and driven away. But the boy knew better now. He knew that his father had a way of dressing his most precious things in the plainest of clothes. A worthless old box had held a fortune. A ruined house had held the truth. And a boy thrown out into the rain had held all along the very thing his father most wanted to save. The boy had learned, the hard way, to look past the worn and weathered surface of things. So he had the house made whole again. He fixed the sagging porch with his own hands where he could, and hired good local people for the rest, and paid them well, and learned their names. He replaced the boards that had rotted through. He pulled the warped gray wood off the boarded window, and let the glass run clear again. And he scrubbed the dust of long years from the floors, until the wood shone warm and honest beneath his feet. And the attic, that close and stifling space where his whole life had turned over in a single night. With the attic, the boy did a thing he thought his father might have smiled to see. He had the small round window in the gable cleared and made to open on its hinge again. He cut a wider space in the slope of the roof and set good clear glass into it, so that the morning could come spilling down into that high room, the way it had once come spilling down the curved staircase of the house on the hill, back when the world was warm. He built long shelves along the walls. He began to fill them, slowly, season by season, with books. He took the place where the great safe had stood, the place his father's last secret had waited so long in the dark, and he turned it into a room full of light. It was on one of those bright, ordinary mornings, sorting through the last of what he had carried out of the woods, that the boy found the thing he had missed. In the rush and terror of that night, fleeing through the hatch with the men's lights swinging behind him in the trees, he had grabbed only what mattered most: the will, the journal, the bound proof, the weapon, the fire. But in his haste, he had left something behind. When the dust had long settled, when the danger was past and the house was his, the boy had climbed back up into the cleared and quiet attic and opened the great steel door once more. Slow this time, and unafraid. And in the very back of it, on a small high shelf he had been far too frantic to search that night, he had found one last thing: a second envelope, smaller than the first, softer to the touch, not bound and sealed shut like a weapon meant for a fight, but folded gently closed, the way a person folds a thing that is meant for one set of hands and no others. His own name, in his father's writing, across the front of it. The boy had carried it down out of the attic into the light. He had set it on the table by the clear new window. And on this bright and quiet morning, with the books standing on their fresh shelves and the sun coming warm through the glass, he finally opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a single folded page. The second was a small recorder, the simple kind, the kind a careful man might speak his heart into near the end, when his hand had grown too unsteady to write down all that he still wished to say. The boy unfolded the page first, and it was not about the will. It was not about Howard, or the proof, or the long and bitter game his father had been forced to play in the shadows at the end. It was about a woman, His father had written, in that thin and fading hand, of a kindness he had done long ago, of a small roadside place out at the edge of nowhere, and of a woman who ran it, who had once stood at the very edge of losing the one thing she had built with her own 2 hands. The boy's father had heard of her trouble somehow, the way he always seemed to hear of such things. With that ear of his forever tuned to the people the rest of the world looked straight through, and quietly, with no name attached to it, with no word said, and no thank you ever asked for in return. He had made certain the woman did not lose her place. He had done it the way he did most of his good deeds, in the dark, for nothing, for no reason at all but that it was the right thing, and he was the sort of man who did the right thing, whether anyone was watching or not. The woman's name was Ruth. Eli read that name on the page, and the breath went still in his chest. Ruth, the woman in the warm yellow window at the edge of the long night. The woman who had set a bowl of soup down in front of a starving, frightened boy and called it waste, so that he would not have to call it charity. The woman who had waved away his last few coins and told him to take care on the lonesome roads. The boy had believed that night that he had stumbled by pure blind chance into the one small pocket of kindness left in a cold and indifferent world. But it had not been chance at all. The warmth that Ruth had shown him had been his father's warmth, coming back around. A kindness his father had cast out into the dark years before, with no thought of any return. Returning at last in the dead of the worst night of the boy's life, to feed his son when the son had nothing and no one. The bread cast upon the water. Come home again. Eli sat with that a long, long time in the bright and quiet room, and he wept, not the broken, hopeless weeping of the cold car on the forgotten road. Something far gentler than that. The kind of weeping that does not hollow a person out, but washes them clean. His father had been gone for months now, and still, his goodness was out there in the world, moving from hand to hand, passing from a stranger to a stranger, finding its slow and certain way back home. When the boy had steadied himself, he picked up the small recorder. He held it a moment in the cup of his palm. He was almost afraid to press it. To hear that voice again, the voice that had once called his name up a curved staircase only to say good morning to him. The voice that had said slow, "Eli, the fish aren't going anywhere," on a dock in the gray gold light a whole lifetime ago. But he pressed it, and his father spoke. The voice was thin and tired. It came and it went, the way a weak signal comes and goes on a far road. But it was his, unmistakably, achingly his. And the boy closed his eyes and let it fill the bright and quiet room. "Eli," his father said, "if you're hearing this, then you found your way, all the way through to the end of it. I knew that you would. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it past everything else that's in this house. I didn't leave you a fortune." A pause. A breath that costs the man something to draw. I did. The money's there, and you'll need it. And I'm glad that you have it. But that was never what I left you. That was never the point of any of this. What I left you is a harder thing to lock inside a safe. I left you how to be a person, son. I left you everything your mother and I ever tried to put into you. To see people, especially the ones the world looks straight through. To be kind when there's not a thing in it for you. To know, down in your bones, that what a man holds in his hands matters a great deal less than what he puts into the hands of someone else. That's the inheritance, Eli. That's the only one that was ever worth a single thing. The men who did this to me, they kept every last thing they could get their hands on, and in the end, they were left with nothing, with less than nothing, because they never once learned the thing I am betting my whole last act on you already knowing. You cannot keep your way to a good life. You can only give your way there. The boy sat very still, the small recorder warm in his open hand, his father's voice moving through him like the morning sun through the clear glass overhead. So here is what I want from you. The last thing I will ever ask of you. Don't let them make you hard, Eli. They'll try. The world will keep trying long after they're gone. After everything you've carried, it would be the easiest thing on this earth to close yourself up tight and trust no living soul and keep everything you have behind a high stone wall. Don't do it. Be soft where it counts, son. Be the kind of man who pulls over for a stranger in the rain. The kind who sets down a bowl of soup and calls it waste, so a proud and hurting person can keep their dignity while they eat. Take what I built and turn it into that, into kindness, into people lifted back up who can't do one single thing for you in return. Do that, and I will have left this world a far richer man than I ever was while I lived in it. I love you, son. I have, since the first day, and I will, long past the last. The recording ended, and the bright room was very, very quiet. The boy sat there a long while in the light his father had asked him to let in. He held the last of his father's voice in the palm of his hand, and he let the warmth of it settle, slowly, into all the cold and hollow places the long winter had left in him. He understood, now, the whole of it. The fishing box had never truly been about a key, or a safe, or a fortune hidden away at the end of a forgotten road. Those had only ever been the shape the lesson took to reach him. His father had spent his dying strength teaching his son one final thing, that the treasure was never the thing locked in the vault. The treasure was the kind of person you became while you went searching for it. A season turned, and then, in its time, another, and the clearing at the end of the forgotten road did not look forgotten anymore. The house stood straight and clean and white in the long grass. Smoke curled up from the chimney on the cool mornings. The window the boy had freed of its warped gray board looked out, clear-eyed and bright, on the trees and the still water beyond them. For there was water, the boy had found. Down past the trees, a quiet, shining stretch of it, with an old wooden dock reaching out over the shallows on tired gray pilings. His father had chosen this place, and his father, the boy had come slowly to understand, had chosen it for the water. On a bright morning near the turning of the year, the young man who was no longer quite a boy stood out on that old dock in the early light. And he was not alone. Beside him stood a small child from one of the families that lived scattered through these woods. The families the young man had come, slowly and with care, to know, to feed on the hard winters, to help where help was needed, and where a person's pride would allow it to be given. The child held a length of fishing line in two clumsy hands and frowned down at it in fierce, furious concentration. "It keeps coming undone," the child said, near tears with the frustration of it, and the young man knelt down on the cold boards of the dock, the way another man had once knelt down beside him. In another gray-gold morning, that felt now like a whole and distant lifetime away. He took the small, struggling hands gently into his own. "Slow," he said. "There's no hurry at all. The fish aren't going anywhere." A pause, and then, softer, the rest of it. The words he had carried with him all the way out of the dark. The words that had turned the last hidden dial and opened the last and truest door. "And neither are we." He guided the small fingers through the knot, slow, patient. The way it had been taught to him, once by a pair of big, warm hands that were gone now, but not gone, living on, here, in the way his own hands moved over a child's, and the line held. The child looked up at him, delighted, eyes shining, and the young man smiled, and the morning light came down warm and gold on the still water. From up the path toward the White House, a voice called out across the morning, "You two coming in? It'll go and get cold on you." The young man turned, and there, on the porch of the White House, with an apron tied at her waist and her gray hair pinned back just the way it had been that first cold night, stood Ruth. She had closed up the little roadside place in the end. There had not been a great deal keeping her out there, and there had turned out to be a good deal more, much to her own surprise, keeping her here. A young man who had needed someone in the world to call him in to breakfast. A bright house at the end of a quiet road that had needed warming through. A family, of the kind that is not made of blood, but is no less true and no less real for the lack of it. The kind, the young man thought, that his father would have understood and welcomed and loved. "Coming," he called back to her. He helped the child gather up the line, and the two of them started up the path together toward the warm house and the good smell of breakfast and the woman waiting on the porch with the door held open. Inside, on the mantel above the fireplace, sat an old green fishing box. The young man had cleaned it up, but not too much. He had left the dents and the rust exactly where they were, because the dents and the rust were part of it, part of the long story, part of the man who had carried it. But it was not a relic up there. It was not a sad and sacred thing kept under glass, gathering the dust of grief. He had filled it, once again, with line, and with lures, and with hooks worn bright from use, because the young man used it now, because his life had not ended in a cold car on a forgotten road, the way two careful, smiling people had so patiently arranged for it to. It had gone on. It had opened, like a window thrown wide to let in the sun, into something his father had dreamed of and worked for, and had not lived quite long enough to see. And as the young man stepped up onto the porch, and Ruth held the door, and the child ran laughing ahead into the warm and waiting house. Eli Carter understood, at long last, the thing his father had spent his whole life, and the whole of his death, trying so hard to give him. They had believed that taking everything from him would leave him with nothing at all. But the thing his father left him had never once been inside that safe. It had been inside the boy the whole long while. And a person who knows how to give, the way he himself had once been given to, by a stranger pulling over in the rain, and a woman with a bowl of warm soup, and a father who hid his whole heart inside a worthless old box. A person like that can lose every other thing this world can take from them, and still, in the end, come home.